I still remember that night like it was yesterday, even though I was just a little kid. I was about 4 or 5 years old, young enough to still crave the comfort of my mother's presence, but old enough to sense that things weren't quite right. My parents had recently separated, and while I didn't fully understand the complexities of their relationship, I knew my world had shifted. My mom had moved us into a small 2-bedroom apartment, the kind of place that was supposed to feel temporary, but it became home in a way that I never expected. The apartment was modest, but it was ours. My mom's room was at the end of a narrow hallway, and mine was just across from hers. The two rooms separated only by the coolness of the hallway that always smelled faintly of jasmine-scented air freshener. I had my own little space, with a bed that was just the right size for my small body, but there was something about sleeping alone that never felt right. So, most nights I ended up crawling into her bed, finding comfort in the warmth of her body, in the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. That night, like many others, we had the window open in her room to let the summer air in. It was a warm, sticky night, and the hum of the outside world, distant traffic, the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees outside, lulled me to sleep. The window was directly behind the bed, above the headboard, and the room had a strange stillness to it. The kind of stillness that seems heavy, like the air is holding its breath. I didn't think much of it, though, not at first. I don't remember what time it was, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, feeling that uncomfortable, uneasy sensation that something wasn't right. It was like a faint pulse of alarm in my chest, but I couldn't pinpoint why. My eyes flickered open, and I saw the silhouette of our cat. He was sitting in the doorframe of my mom's room, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark as he stared into my room. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. Our cat, a scrappy black and white thing we had rescued from the shelter, was always in and out of our rooms. But this was different. He was sitting there motionless, staring back at me, and I had the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. I blinked, trying to shake off the strange sense of unease, but it didn't go away. As I watched him, our cat slowly stood up, padded quietly into my room, and meowed softly. It wasn't his usual demanding meow either. It was almost as if he was trying to get my attention, as if he was warning me. I turned to face my mom, thinking I'd wake her up to tell her about the cat. I just needed to hear her voice, to feel her calm presence. But as I shifted, the room seemed to grow colder, and that pulse of fear in my chest grew stronger. I turned back to look at the door, the open door between our rooms, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing just inside the doorframe. The figure was tall, hunched, and as my eyes locked on him, the world seemed to slow down. I didn't know who he was, didn't understand what he was doing there, but in that moment, everything felt wrong. My heart stopped, a thick fear settling in my stomach. I couldn't breathe. My mind tried to process the scene in front of me, but it couldn't. For a few seconds, the man and I just stared at each other. Then, with a sudden movement, he began to move, stepping quietly into my room like a shadow, and then disappearing from sight. It was as if he was melting into the darkness, moving in a way that felt almost unnatural. I knew then that he was not supposed to be there. My little body froze. I didn't know what to do. Should I scream? Should I run? But I couldn't move. I turned quickly to face my mom, and in those few seconds everything changed. I didn't know how she reacted so fast, but I saw her stir. Her eyes opened wide in an instant, her gaze locked onto mine. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. But even as the words left her mouth, I could see the terror in her eyes as she, too, realized something was off. We both looked back at the door at the same time. But the man was gone. It didn't matter that we couldn't see him anymore. I felt him. I could feel the presence of something dangerous still lurking, just out of sight. My mom didn't waste another second. In one fluid motion, she scooped me up, her arms strong, and threw me through the screen window of her bedroom. I didn't even have time to understand what was happening. The next thing I knew, I was falling, just a few feet to the ground, but still, I remember the shock of the impact, the cold, rough earth beneath me. The world seemed to spin, and I didn't even have time to catch my breath before my mom followed, leaping through the window behind me. We hit the ground in a heap, and I remember her voice, sharp and desperate, shouting for help, her words echoing into the stillness of the night. It wasn't until later that I realized the gravity of what had just happened. The police arrived quickly, flashing lights painting the night in harsh, jarring colors. But they didn't find any signs of forced entry into the apartment. Nothing that would explain how the man had gotten inside. The front door had been unlocked, which led them to believe that the man must have exited through that way. But my mom insisted over and over that she had locked the door, both the deadbolt and the chain lock. There was no way he should have been able to get in. The police speculated that the man might have been inside for a while, waiting for us to fall asleep before he made his move. But they didn't have any answers. Just a sense of mystery hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. A week later, my mom found something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She was cleaning the kitchen when she opened the water heater closet. Inside, she found a small notebook filled with strange names and unsettling drawings. There were also a pair of gloves and a few gum wrappers. The police came again, but all they could do was speculate about what had happened. Who was this man? Why was he in our house? And why had he been hiding there? I didn't know it then, but that night was only the beginning. The feeling that something was watching, waiting, never truly left. Even after the police left, even after my mom did her best to calm me down and make me feel safe again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Something, or someone, who knew where we lived, who had been inside our home, and who might still be lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. To this day, I still don't know the truth of what happened that night. But there's one thing I've always known. When you live with fear, it never fully leaves you. It lingers in the corners, in the cracks where you least expect it. And sometimes, it doesn't even need to be seen to be felt. The days after the incident felt like they stretched out into a never-ending haze of unease. It was as though the world had shifted slightly off kilter, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find my footing again. My mom did her best to reassure me, to calm my nerves. She would tell me that everything was fine now, that we were safe, that nothing like that would ever happen again. But in my young mind, the feeling of being watched was something that didn't just fade away with the dawn. It clung to me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. We went through the motions of our everyday lives. I went back to playing with my toys, watching cartoons, trying to forget about the man in the doorway, the strange sensation of something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. But every time I glanced at the open door between my room and my mom's, a cold shiver would run down my spine. I couldn't help it. My eyes would dart around the room, scanning the corners, searching for any sign that something was out of place. And every night before I fell asleep, I would listen for the soft sounds of the outside world, hoping to hear the steady hum of traffic, the distant murmur of neighbors, anything that would reassure me that we weren't alone. But the apartment wasn't the same after that night. The walls, once comforting in their familiarity, now seemed to close in on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made my heart race. It was like I had become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my chest tight with fear, my heart pounding in my ears, convinced that someone was there. waiting just beyond the door. And every time I turned to my mom, to the safety of her bed, I would find the same look in her eyes. It was a look I hadn't seen before. It was a mixture of fear and determination, like she was trying to protect me from something she couldn't fully explain. And then came the day when my mom found the notebook. I remember it clearly. She had been cleaning the kitchen when she opened the small closet where the water heater was stored. I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly flicking through a picture book, when I heard her call out, her voice tight with confusion. At first, I thought she had simply knocked something over or found something misplaced. But the moment I saw her face, I knew something was wrong. She was standing there, holding something in her hands. A small, worn notebook, its pages dog-eared and stained, as though it had been handled over and over again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through it, her eyes scanning the strange drawings, the jumbled names scribbled across the pages. I watched her face change as she read. First, her brows furrowed in confusion, and then a look of recognition crossed her features. It was like she was seeing something she couldn't quite understand, something that was starting to piece together a terrifying picture. "Mom, what is it?" I asked, my voice small, my throat tight. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she just stood there, staring at the notebook like it was a clue she couldn't make sense of. Her eyes flicked up to me, and for a moment, I saw the same fear in them that I had felt when I first saw the man in the doorway. But then she tried to smile, a weak, uncertain thing. "It's nothing," she said, her voice strained. "Just an old notebook. It must have been left here when we moved in." But I could see the way her hands shook as she tucked it into a drawer, trying to act as though everything was normal. And even though she tried to hide it, I knew that something was wrong. I knew that this wasn't just an old notebook left behind by some forgotten tenant. There was something more to it, something hidden beneath the surface. My mom didn't tell me the details right away, but as the days went on, I could see the toll it was taking on her. She became more withdrawn, more vigilant, as if she were constantly on alert. I would catch her staring out the window, her eyes scanning the street, as if waiting for something to appear. She would check the locks on the doors, sometimes multiple times, before finally settling down for the night. And though I tried to ignore it, the feeling that something was watching, waiting, never fully left. One evening, a week after the discovery of the notebook, my mom spoke to me about it. We were sitting on the couch, and she had just finished putting dinner on the table. Her face was pale, her voice quiet, as she told me what she had found in the closet. The notebook was filled with strange drawings, disturbing images that made no sense to me at the time. But there was one drawing that stood out above the rest. It was a crude, childlike sketch of our apartment building. The drawing was fuzzy and unclear, but I could make out the basic shape of our building and the outline of the windows. And beside it, scrawled in messy handwriting, was a name. It wasn't a name I recognized. In fact, it wasn't a name at all. It was a series of jumbled letters that didn't form any coherent word, and there were others too. Names, dates, strange symbols that seemed to repeat over and over again. But it was the notebook's final pages that unsettled us both the most. There, on the last page, was a sketch of a man. Tall, thin, with hollow eyes, and a wide, unsettling grin. He was drawn in such detail that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. His features were exaggerated, almost too sharp, and something about the way he was drawn felt wrong, like the artist knew something we didn't. It was as though this man had been watching us too, waiting for the right moment to make himself known. My mom was visibly shaken as she told me about it, but she tried to keep her voice steady. I think this man has been in our home before," she said, her voice a whisper. and I don't think he's gone. The police had already investigated once, but they hadn't been able to find any answers. There had been no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing that could explain how the man had gotten inside. But now, with the notebook in hand, the situation felt different. My mom called the police again, but this time they could offer no more than speculation. Maybe the man had been watching us for longer than we realized. Maybe he had been hiding in the apartment, slipping in and out of our rooms when we weren't paying attention. The uncertainty was maddening. And though we both tried to move on, the feeling of being watched, of never truly being alone, lingered in the air like a dark cloud that refused to lift. I started to notice little things that made my skin crawl. Small, almost imperceptible changes that couldn't be explained. A drawer left slightly ajar, the faint smell of something unfamiliar in the air, as if something, or someone, had been in our apartment when we weren't looking. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that the fear was a product of my overactive mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. The man had been there, and he wasn't gone. Even now, as I look back on it, I can't help but feel that there were things we never understood, answers that remained just out of reach, shrouded in the same darkness that had crept into our lives that summer night. The man, the notebook, the strange feeling of being watched, they were all pieces of a puzzle that would never quite fit together. As the weeks passed, the weight of everything seemed to settle deeper, like an invisible pressure that never truly lifted. It was as if life had continued on around us, but we were both living in a different version of reality now. Things that had once felt safe, my mother's reassuring smile, the familiar walls of our apartment, now felt uncertain, tainted by the fear of what had happened and the unanswered questions that hung in the air. My mom continued to act as though things were normal, but I could tell it was taking its toll on her. She seemed more tired, more on edge, her every movement laced with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. I could see it in her eyes when she glanced at the door, or when she checked the locks again for what felt like the 100th time before we went to bed. I knew she was scared too, even if she never said it outright. There were nights when I would hear her wake up in the middle of the night, tossing and turning, the soft rustle of sheets like a whisper in the dark. And when she thought I was asleep, I could hear her speaking softly to herself, as if trying to reassure herself that we were safe, even when I knew she didn't truly believe it. But it wasn't just my mom who felt the change. I began to feel the subtle, ever-present awareness of something lurking nearby, something that didn't belong. It wasn't an immediate, tangible fear, but more like a constant hum in the background, always there. I would see shadows out of the corner of my eye, feel a chill in the air when the windows were closed tight, or hear the faintest sound. A footstep on the hallway floor, the brush of something against the wall, and my heart would race in my chest, my body frozen, listening for the next sound that might confirm my suspicions. But nothing ever came. Nothing except that sense of wrongness that seemed to follow us everywhere. And then it happened again. A few days after my mom found the notebook, after the police had come and gone, after we'd tried to convince ourselves that everything was fine, I woke up one night, startled by the sound of something that wasn't quite right. At first, I thought it was just a dream, the remnants of the night still clinging to my mind. But then I heard it again, soft, faint, a scrape against the wall. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my room. My heart raced, my body stiffened with fear. I had learned to ignore most of the noises in the apartment, the settling of the floors, the sound of the refrigerator humming. But this was different. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't just a random noise. It was the unmistakable sound of something being dragged along the floor. Slowly, like someone was moving carefully, deliberately, trying to stay out of sight. I wanted to call out to my mom, but I couldn't make a sound. I was paralyzed, caught between the overwhelming desire to scream and the terrifying knowledge that if I did, it might be too late. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and finally, just when I thought I would suffocate from the tension, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there, just beyond the door. I don't remember how long I lay there, wide-eyed and terrified, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, but eventually I must have drifted off to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, everything seemed eerily normal. My mom was in the kitchen, making breakfast like she always did. The sun was streaming through the windows, casting warm light across the apartment. But the air was still heavy. I could feel it. I didn't even need to ask her if she had heard the sounds, because I already knew the answer. It was the same unspoken understanding we shared now. There were things we both knew, but could never put into words. The strange noises, the unsettling feeling of being watched, had become a part of our daily lives. I don't think either of us ever fully recovered from what had happened that night. The night when the man had appeared at the door, when the police had come and gone with no answers, when the notebook had been discovered in the water heater closet. There was a lingering question in the back of our minds. Who was he? And why did he come? Even after all these years, I've never been able to shake the feeling that there was something more to that night. That the man, whoever he was, wasn't just a random intruder, wasn't just some fleeting figure who'd slipped into our home and disappeared without a trace. There was something intentional about it, something planned. The notebook, the drawings, the strange symbols. It all felt like a map, a guide to something I couldn't understand. And the worst part was, I knew, even at that young age, that we had narrowly escaped something darker, something worse than we could ever imagine. I never spoke about it much after that, not to anyone. It was a chapter of my life that I learned to bury, to push aside in order to move forward. But there are nights, even now, when I wake up in the dark, my heart racing with the same cold dread that I felt all those years ago. And when I close my eyes, I still see the outline of that man standing in the doorway, his eyes hollow, his smile twisted. And I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, somewhere, watching and waiting. Maybe he was never really gone. As I reflect on that terrifying night and all that happened afterward, one thing is clear. Sometimes the scariest parts of life aren't the things we see, but the things we can't explain. Fear lingers in the unknown, in the things that don't add up, in the moments that we wish we could forget but can never truly escape. If you've ever had an experience that left you questioning what's real and what isn't, I'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts, your own unsettling experiences, or just reach out if this story resonates with you. We are never truly alone in our fears, and sometimes just talking about them can shed light on the dark places we try to hide from. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and always trust your instincts. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows.